Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You've sent us your stack of sources, and we're here again to give you that essential shortcut to being instantly well-informed.
That's right.
And today we're doing, well, kind of a culinary and historical dig into a dish that just screams winter hospitality. Raclette.
Yeah, it's a great topic, a perfect deep dive, actually, because it really shows how something totally practical, born out of necessity,
Yeah.
can, become something quite profound.
Okay.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're going to try and figure out how this really simple, high-calorie meal, I mean, this was literally survival food for isolated herders centuries back.
Right.
How did that turn into this really quite organized modern social event, and for the Swiss, a huge symbol of their national identity?
And what really jumped out at me looking through these sources wasn't just, the amazing flavor, but how incredibly old the whole practice is. When we talk raclette, we're talking about something that started way before most modern European countries even existed.
Oh, absolutely. We have to start the story not in some fancy kitchen, but way up in the Valais region, sometimes called Valais, high in the Swiss Alps.
Okay.
And calling the origins ancient is, well, it's almost an understatement. We can trace this basic technique back to the Middle Ages. We've got documentation, believe it or not, as early as the 13th century.
The 13th century. I mean, just think about that. For second centuries before anyone even dreamed of refrigeration, these herders were using preserved cheese and, well, the simple genius of fire.
Exactly.
But they weren't calling it raclette back then, were they?
No, not yet. The original name, the one we see documented in the Valais Cantonal archives in the States back to 1291, was Bratschess.
Gracias.
Yeah, which is Old High German. It basically just means roasted cheese. Pretty literal.
Okay, right. Roasted cheese. So let's paint that picture. You've got these Alpine herdsmen, totally isolated, maybe spending long, cold winters in basic stone huts, living off whatever they'd preserved.
Exactly right. And when you're dealing with that kind of extreme cold and, being cut off, you need two basic things: dense, preserved calories and warmth.
Makes sense.
And they figured out they could take a half wheel of their semi-hard cheese and place it near the open fire, not in it, that's key, but close enough for the radiant heat to work.
Ah, okay.
And the outer layer would just soften up and start bubbling. It was pure practicality. This warming process actually made the dense cheese easier to digest and obviously super nourishing.
So that warming the bratches, that naturally leads us to how it's served.
Yeah.
And where the modern name comes from.
It does, yeah. The word raclette itself, it comes from the French verb racler,
Which means?
to scrape. Simple as that, because that's what they did. They scraped that soft, gooey layer off the wheel onto their plate, or maybe just some bread.
But even though the scraping goes back to the 13th century, the actual name raclette, or specifically Raclette du Valais,
Yeah.
that didn't show up in print until much, much later.
Way later. We first see it written down in La Gazette du Valais in 1875. So think about it. You've got almost 600 years where this practice was happening, being perfected, before it got its official sort of brand name and started being marketed.
That long delay is fascinating, isn't it? It really underlines that this wasn't like invented by one chef in a tall hat.
Oh, definitely not.
It just emerged organically out of daily life, out of necessity for thousands of mountain people over generations.
Precisely. It's a tradition born from pure ingenuity. The herders needed a way to use their preserved cheese effectively, and they just discovered that warming it by the fire completely transformed it. The texture, the flavor made it incredibly comforting. There's no single inventor of raclette, just this collective discovery.
And it was that sort of collective comfort food vibe that eventually got picked up by people looking to, well, build a unified Swiss identity, right? I found the bits in the sources about the Swiss Cheese Union in the 1930s really interesting.
Yeah, that was a key moment.
They basically took this, rustic regional thing and consciously promoted it as a national icon, right alongside fondue.
That campaign was, well, pretty brilliant marketing because it tapped into something genuinely traditional. But, playing devil's advocate for a second, weren't they a bit worried promoting something that, let's be honest, has a pretty distinct aroma?
Ah, good point. It's not exactly subtle, is it?
Not at all. It's hardly odorless fine dining.
No, but I think they leaned into it. They chose authenticity over maybe refinement. They embraced that strong, earthy character as part of the Swiss identity, associating it with the hearth, home, rugged Alpine life.
And it worked.
It definitely worked. And I think part of why it worked is that raclette has this crucial dual identity.
It absolutely does. People sometimes get confused. Raclette is both the cheese itself, the specific type of cheese, and the whole meal, the whole experience built around melting it.
Right. You need to understand both to really get it or to host a good raclette night. So let's start with the cheese itself. If I'm standing in a shop, what actually defines a proper raclette cheese? What should I look for?
Okay, so it has to be cow's milk. It's semi-hard, and it's typically aged for, say, 3 to 6 months. But the key thing, its whole reason for being, is that its structure is basically engineered for perfect melting.
Engineer how?
Well, it has this slightly nutty, a bit salty flavor profile, but its defining feature, the non-negotiable part, is how it melts. It has to become smooth, silky, creamy, without getting grainy or separating into oil. That's the magic.
Okay, smooth melting is paramount. And then the dish itself, the meal, it feels deliberately simple, doesn't it? It's still connected to that practical herder food. What are the absolute must-have sides?
The foundation, the absolute bedrock, is that melted cheese scraped over small boiled potatoes.
Huh.
And the sources are pretty specific. They often mention waxy potatoes like Charlotte, or even varieties literally called raclette potatoes. You want ones that hold their shape and don't just turn to mush under the hot cheese.
Okay, waxy potatoes. Okay, got it. And then you need something sharp, right? To cut through all that richness.
Oh, you must have the acid. Absolutely essential. That usually means cornichons, those tiny, sharp French pickles and pearl onions. That sharp, vinegary bite just cuts through the fat and sort of resets your palate. You can add things like cured meats, air-dried beef, maybe some ham that's pretty common now. But the absolute core is potato, pickle, onion, and that glorious melted scraped cheese.
So this is where it gets really interesting for me, that evolution from the original campfire scraping. One person managing a big wheel to the modern dinner party.
Yeah, the logistics must have been tricky.
Imagine trying to keep cheese perfectly melted for 8 people from one wheel by a smoky fire. It's very centralized, probably quite laborious, maybe a bit hazardous.
Definitely. The traditional method with the big hack wheel facing the fire, it's impressive, it's great theater. The host or server scraping that golden layer onto each plate, probably risking burnt fingers quite often.
Right.
But the big game changer, the thing that democratized raclette, was the electric raclette grill. Those started hitting the market around the mid-20th century.
And that little tabletop machine, it didn't just change how you cooked it. It fundamentally changed the whole social dynamic of the meal, didn't it?
Oh, completely. That's the sociological turning point, really. It took raclette from being, a served meal where the host does the work into this incredibly social, interactive thing.
How so?
Well, instead of one person sweating over the hot wheel, suddenly everyone around the table is their own chef. Everyone gets their own little pan, the capel.
Yeah, the little pans.
Exactly. And you melt your own portion right there. You choose your toppings, you control the melt. It brings everyone into the process.
I love that idea. It's almost like a mandatory pause button for the evening, too. You can't really rush raclette, can you?
You absolutely can't.
Everyone has to wait for their little pan of cheese to melt just right. It forces this shared, slower rhythm on the meal.
It totally dictates the pace of the evening. It is a slow meal by design. It's built for lingering conversation, for telling stories while you wait for the next melt. It shifts the focus from just, getting through the courses to actually enjoying the company.
Okay, so for those of us wanting to host our own raclette night, let's get into the expert tips.
Yeah.
What are the secrets to getting that perfect, smooth melt? Because we've all had it right. That disappointing, grainy, oily cheese.
Ugh, yes. Awful. The number one secret, the absolute key, is temperature control. And understanding why it separates helps. Raclette cheese has a pretty high fat content and protein, too. If you blast it with really high heat, suddenly the proteins kind of seize up and squeeze out the fat. And that's when you get that greasy, grainy mess nobody wants.
Okay. So shocking it with heat is bad, the answer is.
Slow and steady. Low, consistent heat is your friend. If you're using one of those tabletop grills, don't crank it up to max. Set it to a moderate level and just be patient. Give it time. What you're aiming for is this smooth, silky, aromatic layer of cheese, fully melted, flowing nicely, but, and this is crucial, it should never get brown or crispy.
No crispy bits.
No. If you're scraping from a big wheel, you scrape it the moment it looks soft and almost translucent before it starts to caramelize or bubble too fiercely. Browned raclette is overdone raclette.
Okay, good tip. Never brown the cheese. And what about a practical tip for keeping it nice and melted on the plate? It cools down so fast.
Pre-warming your plates makes a huge difference. Seriously, because you're serving these relatively thin layers of cheese, they lose heat incredibly quickly on a cold plate.
Simple but smart.
A warm plate just helps maintain that lovely flowing texture for a bit longer. Oh, and also, use those little wooden spatulas or paddles that usually come with the grills. They're designed to scrape out the melted cheese cleanly from the nonstick pans without leaving half of it behind.
Got it. Warm plates, wooden scrapers. Now, since it is such a rich meal, what's the traditional drink pairing to cut through all that glorious fat? I'm guessing something light and sharp.
You guessed right. You absolutely need acidity. The classic traditional recommendation is a crisp, dry white wine. Specifically, if you want to be authentic, Fondant du Valais.
Fondant.
Yeah, it's a white wine from the same region, Valais. Its brightness, those mineral notes, they just perfectly balance the intensity and richness of the melted cheese. It stops your palate from getting overwhelmed. It's like a perfect culinary marriage honed over centuries.
Okay, so we've got the history, the techniques. Let's connect this back to the bigger picture. This simple meal seems to carry enormous cultural weight in Switzerland. Why does it mean more than just, a fun, easy dinner party?
Well, in Switzerland, raclette really is a core symbol. It represents warmth, togetherness, that connection to Alpine tradition. It embodies community dining because the whole process forces community.
I mean, forces.
Well, it requires people to be close together around the grill. You're often sharing accompaniments, you're definitely sharing time, waiting for the cheese. It naturally creates this shared experience. Offering someone raclette isn't just offering food. It's an invitation to spend a slow, deliberate evening together. It's fundamental Swiss hospitality.
And especially for the Valais region, where it all started. This heritage is something they guard pretty fiercely, right? It's not just a tourist gimmick for them.
Oh, far from it. It's
Yeah.
absolutely central to their regional identity. They celebrate it every year at the Fête du Raclette, the Raclette Festival. Huge gatherings, people consuming vast amounts, often still prepared the traditional way with the half wheel by the fire.
Oh.
And that deep commitment to authenticity is why it has that official protection status we mentioned.
Right, let's talk about that. The Raclette du Valais AOP. What does that AOP status actually guarantee? What does it mean for me when I'm buying the cheese?
So AOP stands for Appellation Protégée Protected Designation of Origin. It's basically a legal guarantee of authenticity. It ensures that the cheese carrying that label was produced, matured, and processed according to very strict traditional methods, and crucially, only within that specific geographic region, the Canton of Valais.
And when did it get that official status?
The PDO status, same thing. Protected Designation of Origin for Raclette du Valais AOP was officially granted back in 2003 by the European Union. You can find the documentation via the Swiss Federal Office for Agriculture.
So for us buying it, seeing that AOP stamp means we're getting the real deal.
Exactly.
Wow.
You're guaranteed that specific melting quality, that authentic flavor profile that comes from the milk, the pastures, the specific aging process rooted in the Valais Alps. You're not just buying cheese, you're buying like an 800-year-old edible tradition.
That protective status obviously hasn't stopped it becoming popular elsewhere, though. It seems pretty global now, or at least very popular across Europe.
Oh, absolutely. While it's still deeply, deeply ingrained as a Swiss social ritual, the tradition has definitely spread. It's huge in France, Germany, Austria, even up in the Nordic countries.
Right.
And yeah, you see variations now. Restaurants might offer different sauces, maybe grilled vegetables, sometimes even seafood alongside. But the core idea, that essence of melting smooth aromatic cheese and sharing it around a warm communal table that remains sacred, the method really dictates the mood.
So let's try and pull this all together. What does this journey tell us? We've traced raclette from, 13th century brachets, just basic survival food for herders in freezing mountains, all the way to a 21st century AOP-protected global symbol of comfort and togetherness.
I think it's a fantastic story of how practical function evolves into enduring, meaningful tradition. It's a reminder, maybe, that the best social rituals are often the ones that force us, gently, to slow down.
Yeah.
Raclette just doesn't allow for hurried individual eating. It demands that collective pause, that shared anticipation and enjoyment. For the Swiss, as all the sources confirm, it's not just a meal. It's basically a guarantee of an evening filled with conversation, connection, friendship, really.
And that leads us perfectly into our final thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. Consider this. The simple act of using fire to melt preserved food, just to survive an act born from the absolute coldest, hardest necessity high in the Alps.
Yeah.
That very act has transformed into one of the most potent and enduring symbols of modern Swiss hospitality. The method itself, the scraping, the waiting, the sharing around the heat, that seems to be the key to why this tradition has stuck around for 8 centuries.
It's true. We often search for complexity in culture, don't we? But here, the enduring power seems to lie in its fundamental simplicity. Necessity really did give birth to a tradition that, well, continues to melt more than just cheese. It melts barriers, maybe.
A great thought to end on. Thanks so much for walking us through that today. Really fascinating stuff.
My pleasure. It was fun.
We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.